Well, hello and good morning. Welcome to Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress. Today, I'm going to be discussing the financial exploitation of parents in the family courts. Um, and that's pretty extreme, what's occurring right now. The pathology itself is primarily the spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child and the child's induced symptoms as the weapon of spousal abuse. And part of that spousal abuse is to use the court system as a weapon of financial abuse. And so the court is participating in that, not understanding that they are being weaponized by a dark personality parent, manipulated by a dark personality parent into becoming a weapon of spousal abuse from the allied parent. So, and the forensic psychologists, by misunderstanding the pathology and thinking this is really about custody, and it's not, it's about spousal abuse and child abuse. The way it becomes child abuse is because the allied parent produces such significant pathology in the child that it rises to the level of child psychological abuse, shared delusion, factitious disorder. But really, this is a spousal abuse type of pathology. And the forensic psychologists don't understand that, so they participate in that it's a custody issue and then also participate in the spousal abuse, the financial abuse, the emotional, psychological abuse by the allied dark personality parent. So today, though, the custody evaluations themselves are a financial racket. They solve nothing, and all they do is extract the money. Basically shake down the parents in the family court for money because the parents need mental health services. So the parents are kind of stuck because they're only given one choice in the family courts, this experimental forensic custody evaluation. So let's talk about that today. The financial exploitation of the targeted parents in the family courts by the forensic custody evaluators. It's a systematic exploitation by the psychologists of the vulnerable parents in the family courts. So, to begin with, forensic custody evaluations, let's talk about them and the financial exploitation aspect. So that parents are being financially exploited by the forensic custody evaluators in the family courts. The forensic custody evaluations represent a failed experiment that's been conducted on children and parents in the family courts. They lack scientific and legal value, they are dangerous, and they are harmful to children. This is from the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations. By an 11-9 margin, the majority of commission members favor elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children and lack scientific or legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence or child abuse. This is from the New York Blue Ribbon Commission. This is after they looked at everything, this is what they found. I recommend that everyone in the family courts, parents, but especially family law attorneys working in the family courts, listen to this discussion of the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations by two of the commissioners. They are attorneys on the commission, and they provide a rather scathing review of forensic custody evaluation from an attorney perspective and the legal perspective. And I would agree with them entirely, and from the psychological perspective. Their forensic custody evaluations need to be eliminated entirely from the family courts. So the forensic custody evaluation industry in the family courts is a financial racket that's perpetrated on vulnerable parents who need mental health services for their family and children surrounding their custody conflict. There's a tremendous conflict of interest currently in professional psychology with the forensic custody evaluators, because forensic custody evaluations need to be eliminated entirely from the family courts. And clinical psychology, the diagnosis and treatment, needs to return to court-involved practice. However, the forensic psychologists in the family courts don't want that, because conducting the custody evaluations is how they make their living. That's how they make their money in their quasi-judicial role that they've made up for themselves. So right now, there is currently a tremendous conflict of interest with the forensic psychologists in the family courts. And right now, we're in the cover-up phase. So there's a high motivation for all the forensic psychologists and custody evaluators in the family courts to cover up their failed experiment. So because they're making money off of it from the parents, and it's a failure. And so they're going to be held responsible for all the destruction that they caused, and failure in duty to protect, and lack of competence, all the stuff. So they're covering it up right now. But they can't do that for very long. It eventually will come forward. So here's fundamentally where we need to be. We need to get back onto proper roles for the doctors and the judges. The forensic psychologists left healthcare and developed their own quasi-judicial role for doctors. There's no quasi-judicial role for doctors. Doctors should always be doctors, first and foremost. But they left, and because they want to be many judges, and so they developed a new role for themselves. The courts do not need assistance from many judge doctors in a quasi-judicial role of making custody decisions for the court. The court is the expert on the law and its application. The court can make its custody decisions perfectly fine on its own. What the courts need is an accurate diagnosis of what the problem, what the pathology is in the family, and how to effectively resolve the problem. That's treatment. The courts need a diagnosis and treatment out of the healthcare sector. They don't need additional help in making their custody decisions. Judges should not be making diagnoses of complex child and family pathology. Doctors should diagnose the pathology. But the problem is, here's the proper roles. Doctors diagnose pathology, judges decide on custody. Those are your proper roles of the healthcare and legal system, and the proper roles of doctors and judges relative to each other. When the forensic psychologists developed this new quasi-judicial role for the doctor, then doctors decide on custody, but don't diagnose the pathology, so that judges now need to diagnose the pathology because everybody's out of their role. The quasi-judicial role that was developed by the forensic psychologists for themselves, an experimental new role, it failed. It's an experiment. It failed miserably. And we need to go back to the proper roles: healthcare, the legal systems, doctors diagnose and treat pathology, judges decide on custody. So, forensic custody evaluations are a failed experiment. They experimented on children and parents. And the forensic custody evaluations are a failed experiment conducted on parents and children in the family courts. A quasi-judicial role for doctors is an experiment, and the experiment failed. As a result of their failed experiment on children and parents, the lives of thousands and thousands of children and parents were irrevocably destroyed. The forensic custody evaluators did not inform parents or the courts that a quasi-judicial role for doctors was an experimental role, as was their custody evaluation approach developed for their new made-up role. So they didn't inform the parents that they're being experimented on. They didn't inform the court that it's an experimental approach. Forensic custodies or forensic psychologists then offered the court and the parents only one choice: their experimental forensic custody evaluations, and they withheld from parents and the courts standard healthcare services of a clinical diagnostic assessment of the pathology. Forensic psychologists withhold clinical services from the court, and they withhold a diagnosis from the court and from parents. And so it's a nightmare what they're doing, and they're allowed to do it. Here's a quote from Simon and Stahl in 2020, just a few years ago, 2020. As a formal and organized field, forensic psychology has entered its adolescence, but is far from mature. This illustrates the reality that as an organized field and as an organized systematic approach to behavioral science, forensic psychology remains in its formative years. Now, mind you, they began their experiment in the 1980s. So this is 40 years, 4 decades of their doing this experiment in the family courts. And it has no evaluation in all that 40 years. And you look at the New York Blue Ribbon Commission, it's dangerous, harmful to children, lacks scientific or legal value when it's finally has some external review on it. But 40 years, and it is still in its formative stages. They have no idea what they're doing. They're still making stuff up. They're solving nothing, and they're destroying the lives of children and families with their made-up quasi-judicial role and custody evaluations. We need to go back to standard healthcare, get a diagnosis and a treatment plan for the family and the family courts. Judges can decide on custody just fine if we give them an accurate diagnosis and an effective treatment plan. So just to be aware, Simon and Stahl are like the top people. If you're going to hold somebody accountable for the failed experiment of forensic custody evaluations, I would look to Simon and Stahl. They've literally wrote the book and told all the other forensic custody evaluators how to do this made-up new pathology in this made-up new role. Here's a book. 2013 Forensic Psychology Consultation in Child Custody Litigation, a handbook for work product review, case presentation, and expert testimony, published by the American Bar Association. In 2020, they did a second edition, reversed the authors, Simon and Stahl, 2020, same book. So they have 2 editions of the book that tells all the forensic psychologists how to do this made-up quasi-judicial role and their custody evaluation approach. So if you want to hold somebody accountable, I'd say these 2 would seem a reasonable 2 to hold accountable for this experimental approach. Here's from Stahl and Simon, 2013. We strongly disagree with the clinically informed approach. They left to the field of healthcare. They left the field of clinical psychology, diagnosis, and treatment for their new quasi-judicial role. It's very interesting that you disagree with it, but that's standard healthcare. Diagnosis and treatment is standard healthcare. It's unfortunate, or interestingly unfortunate, that you disagree with the healthcare system and you think your experiment is somehow better. From Stahl and Simon, 2013. Because forensic psychology is truly a new field, many child custody evaluators, having been trained only in the clinical tradition, standard healthcare, bring to their work what we call a clinical mindset of a doctor rather than a forensic mindset of a judge. Clinical thinking and the clinical mindset are no longer thought to be appropriate approach to forensic psychological work to them, but that's not a true statement. Clinical psychology and the application of established knowledge about pathology and diagnosis of DSM-5 and how to all the different pathologies and delusional thought disorder, factitious disorder, child abuse, all of that is absolutely appropriate and relevant to the pathology in the family courts. So the clinical mindset is entirely appropriate and relevant. The quasi-judicial role that they develop for themselves, no, that's not appropriate. That judges can decide on custody. They don't need help with that. They need help with the diagnosis and treatment. They need doctors to be doctors. From Simon and Stahl, 2020, just a couple of years ago, the forensic role is a non-helper role. The evaluating forensic mental health professional is not involved in services that have as the goal the alleviation of suffering or discomfort. So I want everybody to understand that really clearly. All the parents and courts and attorneys, everybody to understand that. The forensic custody evaluators do not have as their goal alleviating the child's suffering. They're fine leaving the child suffering. That's not my role. I'm not here to alleviate the child's suffering in this situation. I'm here to make a custody decision in lieu of the court, because the court is somehow farming off its responsibility for custody decision making onto a psychologist. It's all wrong. It's all wrong. We're out of our proper roles. Doctors need to be doctors. Doctors do no harm. Doctors should always be concerned about alleviating the suffering of the child. When a court appoints a mental health professional to conduct a child custody evaluation and offer advisory recommendations to the court regarding the psychological best interests of the children, the evaluator is, in reality, an agent of the state. Doctors should never become agents of the state. Doctors should always remain doctors. Doctors do no harm. From the New York Blue Ribbon Commission report on forensic custody evaluations, in their analysis, evaluators may rely on principles and methodologies of dubious validity. In some custody cases, because of the lack of evidence and the inability of parties to pay for expensive challenges of an evaluation, defective reports can thus escape meaningful scrutiny and are often accepted by the court with potentially disastrous consequences for the parents and the children. This is from an independent review. Okay, so all the custody evaluators say, yeah, we're doing wonderful stuff. When it's independently reviewed, it is awful. What they're doing to parents and what they're giving the court is awful. I review them. I'm not meaningful scrutiny. I review them. They're awful. From the New York Blue Ribbon Commission, they lack scientific legal value. They are harmful to children. They are dangerous. They generate defective reports that have disastrous consequences for parents and children. They need to be eliminated from the family courts. Negligence and the excessive cost. Forensic custody evaluations typically take between 6 to 9 months to complete. Now, that excessive delay represents a negligent failure in their duty to protect obligations when the pathology of concern is possible child abuse and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So, the only cause for a severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, is abusive range parent by one parent or the other. Attachment always motivates bonding. If you have a child seeking to reject a parent, you're worried about child abuse by one parent or the other. authentic or factitious attachment pathology. So just the referral question coming into the psychologist should alert the psychologist that we're worried about possible child abuse by targeted parent, allied parent, and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. I got 2 abuse diagnoses coming into my practice whenever I'm dealing with a court-involved custody case, and I got attachment pathology. To then take 6 to 9 months to conduct that assessment is negligence relative to the danger involved. There's 3 dangerous pathologies: suicide, homicide, and abuse. To conduct a suicide assessment for 6 to 9 months, that's negligence. That needs to get conducted like immediately. Homicide, you're going to conduct a homicide assessment. Somebody's a danger to others, and it's going to take you 9 months to assess whether they're a danger to others. Child abuse, it's going to take you 9 months to diagnose child abuse. We need to get on this much faster. That's just negligence relative to their duty to protect. And forensic custody evaluations typically cost between $20,000 to $40,000, which is an excessively high cost. They are participating in the financial spousal abuse of these targeted parents with their excessively costly forensic custody evaluations, which is the only thing that they offer. They do not offer a more contained clinical diagnostic assessment for around $2,500, $5,000. They don't offer that because it doesn't pay them as much. And so $20,000 to $40,000. And even after that, they render no diagnosis, which we still need for a treatment plan. So you got the differential diagnosis coming in of possible child abuse by one parent or the other, and they don't render a diagnosis on the child abuse or the shared delusion or the factitious disorder. So even after their $20,000 to $40,000, 6 to 9 month custody evaluation, we still need another assessment to get a diagnosis and a treatment plan. Treatment depends on diagnosis. Are we treating a factitious disorder, delusional thought? We still need another assessment even after theirs. They just took $20,000 to $40,000 and solved nothing. And they offered recommendations to the court on what the child's custody should be based on their personal opinions. It is awful. It's a racket. Duty to protect. From Wikipedia, duty to protect. In medical law and medical ethics, the duty to protect is the responsibility of a mental health professional to protect patients and others from foreseeable harm. From Simon and Stahl, the forensic role is a non-helper role. Evaluating forensic mental health professional is not involved in services that have as a goal the alleviation of suffering or discomfort. I would say that right there is a failure in their duty to protect obligations. If they are not, they do not have the goal of relieving the child's suffering from child abuse and assessing the child abuse, that's a failure in their duty to protect. That's foreseeable harm. You come a custody evaluation, you're worried about possible, delusional thought disorder, possible false factitious attachment pathology, possible child psychological abuse. 6 to 9 months on assessment, that's failure in your duty to protect. That's negligence relative to dangerous pathology. In clinical psychology, it is. It's failure in duty to protect. Forensic psychologists, it's routine practice. Forensic custody evaluators fail in their duty to protect obligations. Period. Full stop. That's just a fact. They do. Forensic custody evaluations solve nothing for the family or for the court. They cost between $20,000 to $40,000. They lack scientific or legal value. They are harmful to children. They are dangerous. They generate defective reports with potentially disastrous consequences for children and parents, and they provide no diagnosis for the problem. And forensic custody evaluations are the only assessment approach offered to parents and the courts. There's a tremendous conflict of interest. Forensic custody evaluations and a quasi-judicial role for doctors are a failed experiment in service delivery to a vulnerable population. Forensic custody evaluations need to be eliminated entirely from the family courts. The mental health system response to the pathology in the family courts needs to accurately diagnose and effectively treat and resolve the problem in the family. Forensic custody evaluators in positions of power and authority don't want that. They don't want to change because that is their career. That's how they make money. There are forensic psychologists with names in positions of authority and power who are intentionally disabling the mental health system response to the pathology in the family courts for their own personal financial and career status gain. Here's the racket, the financial racket. The AFCC, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the professional organization for psychologists and attorneys in the family courts. The AFCC is the syndicate that oversees the systematic financial exploitation of parents in the family courts. The forensic custody evaluators with names in positions of authority within the AFCC represent the various families in the syndicate who coordinate the overall financial exploitation operation in the family courts. The forensic custody evaluators in each of the cities serve as the capos who conduct the direct extraction of money. They perform the financial shakedown of these parents in the family courts from the vulnerable parents who need mental health services for their family. It's a psychotic disorder, it's factitious disorder, it's child abuse, it's spousal abuse. They need mental health services, but they're only given one choice, these forensic custody evaluations. They're not given a choice of actual clinical psychological services. Forensic custody evaluations in the family courts are a financial racket of systematic exploitation of vulnerable parents in the family courts who need mental health services for their children and family. Forensic custody evaluations solve nothing. They are a failed experiment conducted on children and parents. Clinical psychology, diagnosis and treatment needs to return to court-involved child custody conflict. In all cases of severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, a proper risk assessment for child abuse needs to be conducted to the appropriate differential diagnoses for each parent. So, with that, that'll end my little talk here on the financial exploitation of parents, a vulnerable population who need mental health services by the forensic custody evaluators in the family courts who are offering only one option, their failed quasi-judicial role, 6 to 9 month, $20,000, $40,000 forensic custody approach. That needs to be eliminated. We need to return to standard healthcare. Doctors need to go back to being doctors, diagnose and treat pathology. Judges can decide on custody just fine once they get an accurate diagnosis and effective treatment recommendations from the doctors in the family courts. So with that, I'm headed off to the rest of my day. Good luck, everybody. This is spousal abuse of the targeted parents using the child and the court system as a spousal abuse weapon. The forensic psychologists are participating in the spousal abuse. The courts and the judges are participating in the spousal abuse until we get an accurate diagnosis and treat the pathology in a proper fashion. The narcissist, the allied parent that we're worried about is narcissistic, borderline, dark personality, dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, dark tetrad. That's highly manipulative. And they're manipulating the forensic psychologists, they're manipulating the family courts into being spousal abuse weapon. It's pretty bad in the family courts. So with that, take care, everybody, and good luck.